had been searching for days, but when they saw a large rock balanced on top of a pile of branches, no one could believe what they had discovered. Saturday, the 11th of September 1926. At 12:10, Emma Harding was busy at work at Greencart's farm near Walwick, where she worked as a maid. She heard a knock at the door. She wiped her hands on her pants and straightened up, and the door knocked again. She walked over and opened the door to find a young Scotsman standing there, asking for food.
Hello?
Emma never had the heart to turn anyone away, so she welcomed him inside and searched the kitchen. She gave him what she could. They chatted a little, and she walked him back to the door, where she watched him cycle away towards Military Road. Shortly afterwards, she locked up and she too left the farm to begin the 2-mile walk back to Walwick Hall, where she had arranged to meet a friend. Meanwhile, at 1 o'clock, Stanley Dalton, a 22-year-old odd job man at the hall, started up his Triumph motorcycle. He gave his eldest sister Margaret a cheery wave and shouted to her and the hall's gardener that he would be back in time to help get the milk in. He rode off down the drive with the engine roaring, leaving a trail of blue smoke behind him. As he rode, he passed Emma as she walked up the drive on her way to the hall. James Rutherford, a local farmer, and his son were driving along Military Road at around 1:20, approaching Limestone Bank. And they slowed down. They noticed a Triumph motorcycle propped up on its stand at the side of the road. But no one else was around. They thought this bike, left alone, was a little odd. But just then, a young man in his mid-30s, looking pale and flustered, emerged through a gap in the stone wall that ran alongside the road and enclosed a plantation of trees. He seemed to be trying to hide his face with his collar of his Macintosh as the father and son passed. James thought about pulling over and seeing if he was okay, but something about the man just felt off. An hour later, and some 11 miles away, Thomas Harvey and his son Angus were now outside their home at Quarry Cottage in Newbridge, when they saw a man ride slowly past on a Triumph motorcycle. They stopped, and both stood watching him go, as this kind of bike attracted attention. But the rider only covered another 300 yards, when suddenly he stopped and slowly got off the bike, and stood there staring back at the two men. He did this for a few moments before he bent down to mess with the bike's engine. Cautiously, Angus Harvey approached him, asking if he could help.
Hello, do you need a hand?
But as soon as he spoke to the motorcyclist, he pulled down the brim of his trilby hat to cover his face and carried on messing with the engine and ignored Angus completely. Angus couldn't be bothered with someone so rude, so he turned back to his dad and they went inside. A few minutes later, the stranger walked past Harvey's front door. But the stranger made a point of turning his face away as he passed, pulling up his Macintosh to help hide his face. They came back out, but the man was gone, and the bike was left still standing there at the side of the road. Now 2.5 hours later, at Low Brunton, some 50 miles from the Harvey's home, Bob walked into the dining room and sat at the table joining his wife Emily Davidson. And just as they were about to have their tea, there was a knock at the door. A young Scotsman stood outside asking for something to eat. It was hard to see his face as he had a fawn trilby pulled down low. Bob Davidson invited him inside.
Come on in.
And as he came inside, Bob noticed what he was wearing: blue overalls and black walking boots. He thought this was a little odd, but he put it out of his mind. The young man sat at the table, joining the couple for tea. When asked what he did, The young man said he was an engineer from Inverness, making his way to North Darlington in search of work. Emily started with more questions, but at this, the young man stood up and asked to wash his hands. The Davidsons noticed that they were covered in something dark. Probably oil, Bob thought. And as he stood up and used the sink, Miss Davidson picked up his trilby, noticing it had Glasgow printed on the inside of the hatband. On seeing the hat in her hands, the young man marched over, taking it from her and looking into her eyes. He thanked her for tea and left the house. It was starting to get late now, and the clock showed 6:30 p.m, and Stanley Dalton's sister Margaret was now beginning to worry. It was long past milking time, and he hadn't come home as he promised. Feeling something wasn't right, she went to her father, and after telling him her concerns, her father reported Stanley missing to the police. Upon hearing the details, the police were not massively concerned, and they told him not to worry. There were plenty of things a young man could get up to that might make him late for home. The next day, Angus also found himself at the police station. Thomas Harvey had kept an eye on the abandoned Triumph motorcycle, and when nobody had come for it by 11:30 p.m. that night, he went out and locked it in his garden shed. And when no one had come to claim it, he sent his son Angus to the police. 5 days later, the 16th of September at 9 a.m, there was another knock at the door at the Davidsons' cottage. When they opened it, they were surprised to see the young Scotsman. Emily asked him if he'd got to North Allerton, like he said when he was last there. He smirked and replied that he'd been a lot further than that, all the way to Preston, Lancashire. Emily then mentioned Stanley Dalton, and that he had disappeared around the same time that she had last seen the Scotsman. He moved uneasily at this. Emily had been reading reports of police appeals for information, so she asked the young man if he had seen anyone on a motorbike in the area. He shook his head, replying that he didn't know the district and took little notice of any traffic. Then Emily showed the young man the Daily Mail newspaper. Mr. Davidson walked over and pointed to the photograph of the spot where Thomas Harvey had discovered the abandoned Triumph motorcycle, which had now been identified as belonging to Stanley Dalton. This had sparked a massive search. The Scotsman again shook his head, repeating that he had seen nothing, and the young man stayed for a bite to eat with the Davidsons, but then left. They followed him to the door and noticed that he had a 3-foot-long parcel strapped to the crossbar of his bicycle. Mr. Davidson stayed in the open doorway, watching him go until he was out of sight before closing and locking the door. The search for Stanley Dalton had really taken off with the discovery of his motorcycle. Searchers were confident that he couldn't be far. It was possible he had fallen or maybe injured himself nearby. On September the 24th at 1 p.m, a search party began scouring the plantation by Military Road at Limestone Bank. Making their way through the gloom of the trees, the group noticed a large pile of branches, topped by a heavy stone which had been taken from a nearby wall. Slowly, they made their way over. The searchers removed the stone, that gave a soft thud as it hit the pine needles that covered the ground. They began shifting the branches, limb after tree limb was removed. And then they all stopped. Everyone looked at each other. 2 feet protruding from the pile. When all the branches had been removed, there lay the decomposing corpse of Stanley Dalton. Sadly, it was immediately identified by his father, who was one of the searchers removing the branches from the pile. Although by now there wasn't much left of Stanley, his father, George Dalton, recognised his clothes, confirming the identification by checking his front teeth. As he expected, 2 of them were missing. George did tell the police constable, James Telford, it was strange. An old pair of brown shoes had been placed neatly by the body, and there was no sign of the new black walking boots, the Moore and Fell type which Stanley had been wearing when he was last seen. More police arrived, and they began searching the vicinity while they awaited for Dr. Wren Dickinson, the police surgeon. 6 feet from the body, Dr. Wren found the victim's cap, and inside lay shotgun pellets. Then the doctor and the constable began gingerly undressing the body, but when the doctor touched the skull, it rolled away, and the lower jaw also became detached. On examining the skull, Dr. Dickinson found a hole about ½ an inch in diameter. The remains were taken to the workhouse mortuary in Wrexham. There, it was discovered that in addition to his boots, he had been stripped of overalls, and was also missing his Macintosh, which had been strapped to his motorcycle. His pockets had also been emptied and his driving licence taken. 2 days later, the results of the post-mortem examination discovered that Stanley Dalton had died from massive head injuries. Now, the police believed that the killer had laid in wait for him, shooting him at close range as he passed on his motorcycle, and then before he fell from his bike, he was beaten around the head repeatedly, and then had been dragged into the woods and left in a ditch, covered with branches, and then a large stone taken from a wall and placed on top, almost like a gravestone. Also, the examination of the recovered Triumph motorcycle revealed that its petrol tank had been peppered with gunshot. Appealing for witnesses, the police said they wanted to question a man described as about 27, 5'9", with a long face and a Roman nose, high cheekbones, and the man was said to wear a light-coloured or yellow-belted trench coat with a fawn trilby. On reading this description, Bob Johnson, a train guard, recalled that he had been working on the Carlisle to Newcastle train on the day of the Daltons' disappearance. As the train stood at the station at Barden Mill at 8 o'clock, a dishevelled man had clambered aboard, and appeared to be agitated, and from the knees down his trousers were covered in mud. Taking pity on the man, Johnson had allowed him to ride beside him in the guard's van. When the train came to a halt about a mile from Hexham station, the man jumped from the train, saying he'd walk the rest of the way, and now putting two and two together, Johnson contacted the police. But around the same time, and about 2 miles away from the train guard, somebody else read the description with particular interest. Living at Lakewood Cottages, Hayden Bridge, a 29-year-old domestic servant, Hilda Bainbridge, was shocked to see that the newspaper's wanted man description matched her fiancé, a Scotsman that had arrived at her mother's home in February seeking lodgings while he worked in the area. And then, the couple had become engaged on August the 21st, planning to wed 6 months later. As alarmed as she was at the detailed description, Hilda decided that it couldn't possibly be her fiancé, but it did get her thinking. About 3 days after they became engaged, he had left the area saying he was going to Scotland to see relatives, and that he said he would be back on September the 4th, probably on a motorcycle, as he had a friend who would lend him one for a few days. She received many letters from him from different locations explaining why he might not be back on a certain date. Until September the 3rd, when she got a letter saying he arrived in East Denton in Newcastle, and was staying with Hilda's sister and brother-in-law, Elizabeth and Thomas Foster. On September the 6th, however, Thomas returned home to find his house had been broken into, and his 12-bore shotgun and 2 cartridges and jackknife and 35 shillings were all missing, along with Hilda's fiancé. After this, Hilda received one last letter from her fiancé, postmarked Crook County, Durham, saying he would be motoring to see her on September the 11th, and expected to arrive by 4 p.m, just in time to take her to Haltwistle's flower show. Hilda, all dressed up, awaited him excitedly. But he didn't show. He didn't show until Saturday the September 25th, and then quickly disappeared again. Meanwhile, the Northumberland police had received warrants from their Scottish counterparts for Hilda's fiancé's arrest on charges of housebreaking. When officers arrived at Hilda's cottage, she told him she had no idea where he was or when he'd be back. but they still entered the cottage and searched the house. The officers took away all the clothes he had left behind and anything that belonged to him. Back at the police station, it had been found that the young Scotsman's background revealed that he had been in and out of trouble since he was 14. At 19, at Moffat in Dumfriesshire, he had accidentally shot a retired army major who had hired him as a valet. The young man said he would fetch a doctor and run off. No doctor came, and he had simply kept on running. He would be caught for theft and sent to Borstal for 3 years. On his release, he would join the army, which he would be discharged for in 1920 for being court-martialed twice for desertion. He would steal whenever and wherever he could, ending up in court in Carlisle, Glasgow and Edinburgh, mostly charged with theft and fraud. After his latest prison stay, a 12-month prison sentence for horse stealing, he married war widow Eva Hedge, mother of 2 sons that lived in Newport, Pagnell in Buckinghamshire. As they came off their honeymoon, he was arrested again. The police were now certain they had their man, 32-year-old Alexander McWilliam Cairns. On October the 8th, Hilda Bainbridge's young sister, who lived in the cottage next door, was in her backyard when she saw Cairns enter the adjacent backyard at the rear gate. "Oh, Alex," she cried, and she burst into tears, telling him of the visit by the police. Cairns went pale. The blood rushed from his face, and he was about to enter the house when she ran in front of him and told him he was no longer allowed inside. Nodding slowly, he told her it was all a mistake, and he would go to the police station straight away and clear his name. And that was the last time Margaret Bainbridge would see him. Within an hour of newspapers publishing a police appeal about anyone that has any information about Cairns to contact them immediately, he was spotted in the village of Whitfield, arrested and taken 12 miles north to Hexham police station, where he was questioned by Inspector Edward Russell. He refused to say anything in response to the charges of housebreaking until Russell told him he was also suspected of murdering Stanley Dalton.
Are you willing to make a statement about your movements on the 11th of September?
The inspector asked him.
I knew it was working up to that,
Cairns replied.
But I had nothing to do with it. I will make a statement, but it will be a long one.
And so it was. Cairns said that upon his release from prison, he had met a man named Joe Kelly, who wanted to form a criminal partnership.
Then I said I was going straight. I had enough of prison life.
And then I met Kelly again in Newcastle, and again refused to join him. Kelly subsequently approached him 2 more times, once tapping on the window at the Fosters' home. Cairns had finally agreed to meet with him, and another man a few days later in Carlisle. At the meeting, the other man, Cairns said, was introduced to him as Kelly's partner. Cairns thought he sounded Australian. Kelly had seen the gun at Thomas Foster's home and asked Cairns to get it for him.
He promised he would take me into the partnership, as he was a flash crook and all the rest of it, and I'd have plenty to spend, lots of money if I went with him. I said I would see if I could get it.
Cairns' statement went on to say that he had taken the gun from the Fosters' home, subsequently going to Scotswood and handing it over to Kelly and the Australian, who had pretended that he wanted the gun because he was a shooter.
They told me they were going to work on a big job, and they took the gun from me and they told me to hang around here for a bit. He told me there was something big going around here. The next day they met me again, and I told them that I could not hang around there as I had no money or anything. They said they had not very much money until they pulled off the job they were going to do. They gave me 6 shillings and told me to take a look around and do a job for myself. I met them, they went right on, and told me to go on until I fell in with them again. I went about 3 miles and I met them on the other side of the road. It was on the top of the bank, in a sort of quarry. They had the bike there too. They told me to stay beside the bike. They left the bike and went away on foot back the way they had come. I waited 4 hours for them. I think it would be well into the afternoon, as I had no watch and I did not know the time. The Australian came back and he gave me a pair of boots. He told me I was to put them on, and a pair of black overalls. He said I could pass as an engineer. I gave him a handout with the bike. He told me he had to go back and give Joe a hand with the swag. He said if I passed them on the road not to let on. I knew them, and to meet them in North Allerton on Monday. I was up there on Monday. They did not turn up. I never saw them.
Cairns went on to say he subsequently cycled to Carlisle and left his bike to be repaired, and then went on foot to Edinburgh, doing another burglary on the way, in which, of course, he took some cartridges which Kelly and the Australian had asked him to get for them, and he met Kelly again in Edinburgh, and Kelly told him to hang on to the cartridges for the time being. So he left them at his Edinburgh lodgings, while he went to Lipwood Cottages and intended to spend the weekend there. He stopped and looked up at the officer and said,
"That is as much as I need to tell you, as you know the rest."
He looked down and signed the 15-page statement, which he had spent more than 2 hours writing. Before he was taken back to his cell, the inspector asked him about 2 letters which he had handwritten only 2 hours before his arrest. One was addressed to John Laughlin, his landlady's son in Edinburgh, and the other one was addressed to a man called Sinclair, saying he was on the run and on the rocks. Cairns did not reply or look at the inspector, and the police already knew about the parcel that was stashed away at Cairns' lodgings in Edinburgh. 6 shotgun cartridges, a revolver with a single bullet, and a jackknife. Cairns declined legal aid, as he wished to offer no defence, and after several remands made his 5th appearance before Hexham magistrates on November the 5th, charged with Stanley Dalton's murder. Cairns, wearing his favourite blue suit, pleaded not guilty to murder, and appeared before Mr. Justice Fraser at Newcastle's Moot Hall on Thursday, February 24th, 1927.
Well then,
Mr. Mortimer Casey, prosecuting, told the jury, and went on to describe how James Rutherford and his son had seen a man emerging from a gap in the plantation wall, next to the motorcycle standing nearby. Mr. Martin said there could be no doubt it was Dalton's motorcycle, and that Stanley Dalton was probably lying terribly mutilated in the wooded area. He then went on to tell about a man wearing blue overalls and a fawn trilby, apparently taken from Dalton, that had later called at the house in Low Brunton, where he washed his oily hands and had thanked Emily and Bob Davidson for tea. And with the description from Angus and his father of a man standing with a motorcycle on the road before walking off and leaving it, Mr. Mortimer said this can only be Cairns. A short time later, his fiancée, Hilda Bainbridge, was called to the witness box by Mr. Osbert Peake, defending, and was asked why she had burnt one of the letters from Cairns, and why Cairns had written to her asking her to reply to him at places that didn't exist, such as Moor Cab in Coxwood and the Crown Hotel in North Allerton, where he had never stayed. Weeping, she replied that she had no explanation. As she stood there crying in the witness box, Cairns looked on, beaming. But Stanley Dalton's father and sister buried their faces in their hands, as the victim's skull, now sawn in half, was produced by the pathologist, Professor Stuart MacDonald, as an aid to describe the murder and to understand the injuries. Professor MacDonald then told the jury that he found a perforated fracture on the right side of the skull, which he thought had been caused by a shotgun pellet. He had also found a pellet embedded in the inside of the skull, and other injuries that had been caused by great blows of violence from the butt of a gun. Then the defence rose, with Mr. Peake going on to suggest that Dalton had met his death by driving too fast and hit the wall near the spot where his body was found. He also said the shotgun pellets which had struck the victim had been fired by someone shooting rabbits, to which Mr. Mortimer ridiculed the defence by saying that
if that was the case, someone shooting rabbits, then the angle of the shots means that the rabbit must have been sitting up a tree.
But the defence replied that someone might have fired them while Dalton was lying dead, unwittingly shooting the concealed corpse in the head. He went on to say that the prosecution had suggested no motive of theft of Dalton's motorcycle. He argued there was insufficient motive for murder, because a motorcycle could be stolen at any time of the day by anyone who knew anything about them. The defence then suggested Dalton had been killed by Kelly and the Australian, because Cairns wouldn't help them commit a robbery at Walwick Hall. Then finally, the defence pointed out within 2.5 hours of the murder having been committed, and with 1,000 yards of where it was committed, Cairns had called at 3 farms asking for food. If he was guilty of the crime, wouldn't he have taken great precautions against being identified? He then turned and asked the jury, bearing in mind the evidence, do you think there'd be a time for the accused to commit the deed, drag the body into a ditch, take off Dalton's clothes, and put them on again? After retiring for 90 minutes, the jury returned. They were asked by the court clerk if they were agreed on a verdict. The former replied,
No,
"Do you mean it's impossible for you to agree?" asked the judge.
I think so.
"Then if you think it's impossible for you to come to an agreement, I must discharge you." Standing in the dock, Cairns smiled broadly. But 2 days later, Mr. Judge Fraser ordered a retrial to take place at the following week at Durham Assizes. In his cell at Durham Prison, Cairns told a warder,
I am utterly fed up. The judge summed up in my favour, and I would have bet £100 to a penny if I had it, that I would have got away with it.
While he was in his cell, he realised there was more than one way to get out of prison. Behind the bath in the prison hospital, to which he had access, he began chipping away at the plaster. He soon exposed the bricks and loosened them up, and planned to remove them when the opportunity arose, and drop down into the exercise yard and climb over the wall to reach freedom. However, he made one mistake in sharing his plan with a fellow inmate, who promptly told a warder. After this, Cairns was kept under constant surveillance. Wednesday, the 23rd, the new trial started. The judge, Mr. Fraser again presiding, Mortimer prosecuting, and Mr. Peake defending. This time, the prosecutor did his utmost to persuade James Rutherford to identify Cairns as the man he had seen emerging through the gap in the plantation wall. But Rutherford kept saying he couldn't be positive. "I am unable to say in confidence," he told the court, "that the prisoner is the man I saw." The prosecution had also said Cairns told a different pack of lies to just about every witness he had spoke to, and almost everything in his letters to his fiancée had been untrue. And if he was innocent, why would he have told all those lies? And on his bicycle, the prosecutor continued that there was a parcel about 2-3 feet long and 9 inches in depth. This was seen by multiple witnesses, and I suggest that inside that parcel was the shotgun stolen from the Fosters, with which Cairns committed the murder, and had hidden away in the vicinity and later gone to recover it. In reply, the defence again suggested that the victim had been shot by someone shooting rabbits, to which the prosecution then called a gamekeeper, Charles Hook, who testified there had been no shooting parties in the area on September the 11th. To which the defence asked, "Well, what about poachers?" But the gamekeeper said the area didn't suffer from them. Cairns' ex-fiancée, Hilda Bainbridge, watched from the gallery, dressed entirely in mourning black. She watched as Cairns left the dock and stepped up to the witness box to tell the jury about Joe Kelly, whom the police had been unable to trace or find any sign of. He said he had first met Kelly at the Salvation Army hostel in Glasgow. Kelly's Australian partner, whom he met later, was known as the Boss. Cairns then went on to reveal the rest of his account, which was much the same as his earlier evidence in his statement. Although the overalls he previously described as black, he now said were blue. The prosecution then asked,
What was the gun wanted for?
Cairns replied,
The Australian wanted to join a shooting party to get an insight into a job which I think was a housebreaking.
Have you ever heard of any man joining a shooting party with only 2 cartridges?
asked Mr. Mortimer. Cairns shrugged and remained silent, looking down at his hands.
What hold does this man Kelly have over you?
Asked the prosecution.
None, except I was afraid he might tell my friends all about me.
He replied Cairns.
How could Kelly know you were staying with the Fosters? And where the Fosters lived?
I don't know.
Shrugged Cairns. The prosecutor then reminded Cairns that Thomas Foster had said it was impossible for anyone to see his gun, unless they were inside his house as it was tucked away in a corner.
Did Kelly go inside the house?
Asked Mr. Mortimer. No. The prosecutor then produced a map and asked Cairns whether he was pointing to the spot where a rope ladder had been hidden. After studying the map for a few moments, Cairns said he was sure that was the place.
That is strange,
said Mr. Mortimer.
There is no hedge at all at that spot. The road is bounded by a wall.
On the 25th of March, in his summing up statement, Mr. Judge Fraser told the jury, because this man on his own confession is a liar and has done very wrong criminal things, does not prove he is a murderer. The prisoner has admitted to stealing a gun and 2 cartridges, and he was seen close to the scene of the crime within an hour of the murder being committed. You also have the facts that Dalton's boots and overalls were taken away, and you may presume that they were taken by the murderer. You may think that the class of boots would make a strong appeal to a man in a certain class of life. And in the prisoner's favour, you will remember that there's been no evidence whatsoever in identification. You have got to be satisfied beyond all reasonable doubt before you can convict this man of murder. The jury went away, and an hour and a half later, they returned to find Alexander McWilliam Cairns guilty. On hearing this, Cairns went pale, swaying slightly in the dock, shaking his head. A warder tapped him on the shoulder, and then without a backwards glance, he disappeared down the steps into the cells. But many people he had never met, but who were united in their opposition against capital punishment and the horror of the death penalty, wrote to the Home Secretary to get him to give Cairns a reprieve. With the fact the jury disagreed at the first trial should be sufficient justification for cancelling the death sentence in this case. In the condemned cell in Durham Prison, Cairns became increasingly depressed, and as day followed day and preparations began for his execution, with only 5 days to go to the appointed date, Sunday the 24th of April 1927, he was told he had been given a reprieve. His sentence had been commuted to life imprisonment, and he was reported to have responded by dancing a Scottish jig. He was expected to serve 15 to 20 years, which meant he'd probably be free again before he was 50. On hearing that her ex-fiancé had been spared, Hilda Bainbridge broke down and wept. Opinions at the time were divided, with many believing Cairns to be guilty, and all those convinced of his innocence wanted to know why Joe Kelly and the Australian hadn't been found. Well, that'll about do it, but to let you know, 32-year-old Alexander McWilliam Cairns from Carluke came from an extremely respectable home. His father had set up a tailor shop and then had become postmaster. Alexander had a really good upbringing. And on the day Stanley Dalton was buried, the small village virtually came to a standstill. Hundreds lined the roads, looking on in silence as the coffin arrived from Hexham, on a lorry covered with laurels. It was driven slowly to St. Peter's Church, where in the graveyard Stanley was interred next to his mother, who had died 3 years earlier, and his elder brother, who was killed in action in 1917. Let me know what you thought of this video in the comments below, and if you think he was a rogue and a murderer, or it was Kelly and the Australian. I would love to hear your take on it. And as always, thank you for your support, and take care.